Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Bay, and I hope you're having a great day. Today, I want to talk about something that made me quite sad. You see, I have this deep principle and deep sense of justice, of fairness. And when that principle gets violated, I get angry, which is why today I was super angry watching the results of the European International Championship for VGC. Now, I might be being a bit dramatic, but earlier today, or whenever you're watching this, so in the past, Yuto Kiramara was told, "Hey, you have a win in it." His round was streamed, and if he won that round, he would advance to the next round of competition, the top 16. But when the chips fell, he was 17th, and they took the top 16. And so Yuto, even though he was told on stream was going the next round, ended up not going to the next round. And this is a little bit frustrating, and why I'm irked is because he had the same record as many other competitors. In fact, he has the same record as a majority of the competitors in the top 17, 11 and 2, all the way 4 seed to the 17th seed. And if you look, you'd be like, oh, well, there's other tiebreakers that can help determine, things, right? Well, in VGC points, but as you can see, there are no ties, which is something we're going to talk about in a second. So all the points don't matter. It's just like whose line is it anyway? And then you look at here the next differentiator, which is op win percentage, right? And that's something you as a competitor don't have control over. Yes, winning earlier in a tournament might mean you're more likely to face better opponents because you match based off of your seeds. But why is winning earlier in a tournament better than winning later? I don't know. Which is why I wanted to talk about a couple things today that can maybe help solve some of these problems. And I think a big part of it is the lack of agency it feels like players have when it comes to these tournaments. You do these rounds and you're kind of, the seeds are at the behest of who you happen to face. And so you might be wondering why is this guy talking about this? Well, in my real life, I have been a speech and debate teacher for many years, and I've been running speech and debate tournaments for over a decade. I was in charge of the Los Angeles District League, and as a result, I had to oversee in my life. I've overseen hundred tournaments, and I think about how can we make things fair. I love sports, I love competition, but I also love fairness because if not, I get irked. And so hopefully today I can provide some ideas that may or may not work, but at least can make things feel more fair in the VGC scene. But first, before we get into that, I want you to look at one particular thing. I mentioned the points earlier, right? I said that, hey, there's in VGC, the points don't matter. It's just like whose line is it anyway? And there's a reason I mentioned that. And let's look at the trading card results first before we get into my points. Now, in the trading card game, it is a possibility to have a tie, right? As you can see here, many of the competitors have ties. And the reason this matters is that there are 3 outcomes in a match. You have win, loss, or tie. In VGC, technically, in theory, it's possible to tie, but you really can't because there's so many rules and ordering and things like that. In fact, if you were to look through all of the standings of the 1,455 players, there were no ties in the VGC tournament, right? Which goes to show this is not something that's happening. But in TCG, it is happening. And the reason that matters is points. Here, the points matter, right? You having 12 wins or 12, like the ties affect it. But in VGC, when everyone has the same win-loss, points don't matter. And so what I want to do today is talk about first how we can kind of fix points and other factors or statistics that we can add that will make things a bit more fair. So this is how, in my opinion, we can fix VGC seeds. Again, I think about tournaments law and fairness, and I think the more data points we can have, the better it's going to be. So first, what can be approved, right? Minus winning a set, a competitor has no control over their seeding. And how you win a set doesn't matter, right? You could win 2-0, 2-1. It's the same in terms of the tournament. But I think we'd all agree that's not necessarily the same in terms of performance, right? And during a sports season, right, you'll face every team, right? So you can have a head-to-head tiebreaker, but there's also just more opportunities for competition, right? In an NBA season, you have 82 games, baseball, you have 160. And obviously we're talking about a tournament versus a season, but the reason this matters is there are less data points to stick to in VGC to determine how good someone is, right? And so more data points, especially when for some of you might be like, oh, 12 games, that's a lot. And the totality of a competition that has 14, 15, 4,000 people in TCG, right? That doesn't really matter that much, right? That's not that many opportunities to face people. And so all these other data points, I as a competitor don't have any control over, right? And that affects your placement and points. And I'll give you a personal example. When I competed at the Las Vegas Regional, I went 4-4, which I was very happy about. It was my first regional. Woo! I placed 263. My goal was to come in top 256 because that affected championship points. My op seed was actually very good in the 4-4 bracket. It was towards like the very top, which is why it was even the 200s to begin with. But I had all my opponents except for one had a winning or at least 50-50 percentage. But that one opponent that didn't have that, right? That opponent essentially is the reason I didn't get the same amount of championship points as other people who went 4-4. And that's not my opponent's fault or necessarily my fault, but this is something I had no control over, right? And this can make tournaments feel unfair, right? If I'm Yuto right now, I'm probably feeling sick to my stomach of like, what could I have done differently? Other people in 11-2, well, should I have gone back in time and changed the computer algorithm so I face different people? Like, no, you can't control that. And so this is where I think adding a couple more data points will be very helpful. So how do we fix points? So in an event with virtually no points, points doesn't make sense. So I think we should change what we consider a point. And I think you could do this in many different ways. This is just an idea to kind of get our brains started. So I think each match should have a win, loss, and a point. Basically, you're creating 4 outcomes that could happen in a match, right? You could win and get a point. You can win, not get a point. You could lose and get a point, and you could lose, not get a point. So let me explain how this works. This will seem more complicated, but than it sounds. But I want you to stick with me because I really believe in this idea. So first, if you win and you go 2-0, you get a point, right? The goal is to win, and if you win in dominant fashion, you get a point for that. But if you lose, but it's a 2-1 set, right? Because sets are played in best of 3, then that's a resilient loss, and so you get a point, right? And this is a good idea because this rewards dominant wins and it rewards resilient losses, right? If you told me someone every round that they lost, right? They were losing in game 3 versus someone who every time they lost, they were losing in game 2. I would tell you that the person who's losing in game 3 every time is probably playing better than the person who's losing in game 2 every time. Same thing for winning. If you told me someone had all their wins and they won in 2-0 fashion, I'd assume they're more dominant or have a stronger team than someone who is winning all their matches but losing in 2-1. And again, this is a second tiebreaker. We're not changing the win-loss tiebreaker. We're just changing the second tiebreaker from op seed to points and actually having points matter. Because right now it is points. Points is the second tiebreaker, but they have no difference to their outcome because, again, there's no ties in VGC. So I think this would be a really cool way to create sort of a stratification of what is a 11-2 what, right? That helps us understand a little bit better. And it shows how dominating a performance is. And that's what numbers are meant to capture in these tournaments, right? Win-loss is showing a data point. These points can be showing a data point. And I think you can go a step further. And this would be the second thing I would implement on top of fixing points, is I would implement some sort of differential. So sports use differential, which effectively means the amount of points you score versus the amount of points your opponent score against you, and you add it. Basically, the way I imagine the points situation is it's a net number, right? So it's an absolute number. It's always going to be positive, never negative. But differential can be positive and negative. And it's the third tiebreaker. So if I go 7-1 and I got 6 points and an opponent went 7-1 and they did great as possibly as good as they could and they got 8 points, they're still beating me. Doesn't matter what differential is. This is only if we tie. And so differential would be the number of Pokemon you had standing at the end of the game versus what your opponents have standing, right? And so if you were to have a perfect set, which would be very hard in VGC, you keep all 4 of your Pokemon alive, both games, and win, right? You would get a win, a point, and a +8 differential. And these are just more data points that can be helpful for, again, determining the seeds. And if seeds are literally going to be the reason why someone can qualify to the world championship versus being kicked out before top cut, I think that matters, right? We should have more data points and things we have control over, right? And the interesting thing about this particular thing is that in theory, you can win a set, but get no points, right? Or actually, you can get negative. And the worst you could do is -2, right? If you win 2 games with 1 Pokemon each and then lose another game 4-0, right? You actually get a -2 score. And again, that's reflective of what happened in the match, right? If you got totally destroyed in a particular like game, right? That kind of matters. And so what this system does is it creates a few different ways to look at how people are competing, creates different analysis. You have your win-loss, which is how you're doing in the set, right? And then you have your points, which determine how were you doing within the set, right? Are you dominating? Are you just getting there? What's happening with that? And then differential is by game, right? And so basically you have bigger picture, smaller picture, smaller picture, and each of those things can help delineate. Now, I can already sense there's going to be some pushback, so I'm going to go through some of the potential issues with this. So first is buys. Buys don't happen too often, but if there's an uneven amount of people or something goes on, right, someone can get a buy. I think in this particular situation, you give them a win, but no point and no differential. You may say, hey, that's unfair that someone could be hurt because they're not getting plus differential for a buy. I'd say it's also unfair you get a win for not competing against someone. So this way it's less impactful, right? You don't, if you have a tournament where someone gets a buy, that buy still is not ideal because you didn't actually earn the win versus someone who actually went out to earn the win or potentially earn the win. And this a criticism is, couldn't this make people more aggressive, right? Oh, 2-0s are going to be helpful, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the goals of a player, right? Every person's goal is to win 2 games, and if you lose the first game, your goal is to take it to 3 games anyway. So the only potential change I could see would be how people may consider sharing information, right? Revealing information. You might be less inclined to sack a Pokemon and things like that. But again, the overall goal is still to win the set. That's the number one thing. This is just a secondary factor for you to consider in terms of the competition. So I don't think it really changes the incentives of the players to make them more aggressive. And I would say, which may be controversial, if it did make players more aggressive, that might be a good thing for both the tournament, right? I can tell you as a tournament operator, I loved when things were very clear cut and fast, right? You're just like, okay, cool, we get to move on. Also makes it more exciting for the audience. But again, if you're super aggressive and lose 0-2, it has the same impact as being aggressive and winning 0-2. So there's still a negative drawback for being aggressive having not working. So I think at the end of the day, it won't make players more aggressive. And if it did, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for the game. Another thing might be, well, if we use KOs as a differentiator, like I mentioned as the third differentiator, some players would have more games than each other. But actually, what's really cool about this system is if you do it as a net, like as an absolute for points, then the amount of points a player has will indicate how many games they played, right? If someone went 8-0 and had 8 points, we know that they went 2-0 in all their matches. They played 16 games. And if someone else went 8-0 and got 8 points, we know they played 16 games because they went 2-0 in each of those, right? And so then you can accurately use differential as a tiebreaker within the same points bracket. Similar in this example, right? If you have 2 players that were 7-1, one person got their loss in a win, or the round they didn't get a point in a win. So one of their wins, they went 2-1. Right. And then another player, they went 7-1. And maybe the one time they did get their point is in a loss. Right. So they won all their matches 7-0, 2 games, and then they lost 2 games. And so as a result, they're going to have the same amount of games on the onset when that happens. So the reason I think this is good is it gives players more agency, right? You have more control over the factors that determines your seeds, right? You have some control in how many games there are in a match, right? How well you play will determine that. Differential will be affected by how well you play, how many Pokemon you have left, right? And yes, it might create some small incentive differences in playstyle on the fringes, but again, I don't think it changes too much. If you're winning the first game, you don't want to reveal it won't change your tactics and your strategy that much. Also, if you know a person's above you or there's a certain threshold, that gives you something to shoot for or play for. And that feels, as a competitor, that feels better. Hey, if I'm 17th, but I know hey, I got to get this extra point to get there, that gives me some clarity in what I should do, right? And this gives some clarity of seeds, right? You want to have surprises like Wolf did a few years ago at the Worlds, where he talked about in his World Championship video where he thought he was going to get a bye and then didn't because there was confusion in the op seeds and how they were doing it. Well, This would make it more clear because the second tiebreaker is like a known thing, right? It won't be as confusing. And same with differential, right? So the only kind of like, you might not know from round to round what your differential point is, but you have a sense of how other people are doing. And like one competitor won't, change the op seed so much that'll affect it. And I think agency is good, right? If you compete in something, you want to feel how you have control over it. If you're spending money, if you're flying across the world, you want to feel like you have control over it. Which is why I could see people saying, hey, this is going to be difficult to implement. I'd say first, we're talking about the lives of thousands of people. We can spend a couple of more minutes to make it fair so people feel like they're getting their time and money's worth. And also for VGC, it's important. If it doesn't feel fair, people are not going to compete. People are not going to want to join or learn if they're like, oh, these two people have the same record, but one gets to compete and the other doesn't, right? Again, that creates the confusing incentives. And it's just two more pieces of information to add to a match sheet, right? You would just add which person got the plus, right, or the point, and you would include the differential, right? And this is no more complicated than a computer deciding what your op seed is, and it needs to know everyone's win loss before it does an op seed, like opposition win percentage anyway. And so as a result, it's not that more complicated for the computer to process. Like it's just a couple more data points, which I guess, is a bit slower when entering it. I do understand that, but I think it's also more fair to do so. And again, you can probably have ways to simplify it. If you need to do like a barcode scan, you can give a certain threshold of outcomes. And I'd say just something to think about is for setting matches, I'd still set up the matches the same way that you currently do. I wouldn't change it to that you're facing someone with the same points as you. I would just keep it the same win loss, because I think it's unfair if like you and your opponent are both like 7-0 undefeated and you're facing each other because you have both have the same amount of points, right? That doesn't feel as fair as like, oh, like why do two other 7-0s who are undefeated but have less points get to face each other, right? And so I think you still want to keep the randomness, within the win loss bracket. If anything, I would have like the top person in a win loss bracket face the lowest person in win loss bracket. So you're in theory coalescing around the best two players throughout the duration of the tournament. That's probably still a bridge too far, but just something to think about. Again, this is about fairness for people in their competitions. And that's the thing that matters, right? Ideally, we should never eliminate someone on win-loss record. I think you should always have the extra round, but at least you're being eliminated over something you had control over as a competitor, rather than the computer RNG deciding you face these people. And what if my opponent in Vegas like got a better breakfast? Would I have gotten more championship points? Like that's a weird thing for me to have to worry about, right? Whereas if I know like, oh, I got less points than my other competitors, at least I have something to understand why I am the seed that I am. And that's why I think these things matter, right? It also better captures performance and how wins and losses were, right? Not all wins or losses are made the same. In this system that I told you about, I went 4-4, and I told you that I faced a lot of, I had a pretty good opposition opponents. But here's the matter of the fact: almost every match I won was like three games, and then everyone I lost was like I got killed. And so even though I was 4-4, it wasn't a good 4-4, but it looks like a good 4-4 because of I happen to face good people. Again, that's not a reflection of how I actually did in the tournament. And so we want to capture that better. If someone's winning every round and dominating, this better captures that. Also, tournaments are about rewarding who is the best player. And better seeding helps ensure that better players are hitting at the end. And ideally, you have the best two competitors in finals. Obviously, Pokemon is not a purely, like skill based. There's lots of luck. There's lots of things going on. There's lots of rock, paper. There's a lot of different competing elements. But ideally, right, we're getting to the stronger competitors who are winning in more dominating fashion will eventually face each other at the end. And this is a better way to ensure that, because right now seeds are honestly pretty random. And that makes me think about how fair are brackets, how fair is everything going on, right? And this is just a way to implement a bit more fairness into the scene. Also, I would also say like the tournament today should have added around. I think one thing that the tournaments are not doing is thinking how you can creatively fix time into a schedule. And I think about this as someone, again, I've run competitions where you're taking over a whole college and hundreds of rooms, and you have students competing all these sorts of different places. But so what you could have done in the particular situation today, right? So you have Yuto face Shohei, who was the 16th and 17th seed. You have them face in like a bubble match. But what you do is you have all the other top 16 matches happening, except for obviously the one seed, because the one seed doesn't know who they're facing. And you stream one of the matches. We all know usually the stream match takes the longest. And so you have the stream match going while the bubble and the rest of the top cut is happening. So you have 8 matches going on, and then the stream will probably take a little bit longer. I think ideally you have the stream matchup against the person who's facing one, because then that way they're both kind of distracted a little bit later. And then what you do is in the round of 8, you stream, because in the round of 8 they're streaming all 4 matches. You just stream the one that's not affected by the bracket, or the first one that finishes, right? You could just do it like that. And then eventually things are going to get caught up, right? The best of 8 rounds, we're going to see 4 30 to 50-minute round competitions, right? We have plenty of time to fix that other round that hasn't happened, and slowly it'll creep its way up and it'll be fair. And this is a way you can add a round without losing time. And then you don't have this problem to begin with. But I think part of the reason people are reacting so strongly the way they are is there was nothing Yuto could have done to change how he placed, right? And that can feel tough. And obviously, not everything can be super fair, but in a competition where, worlds and things like that, where thousands of dollars on the line, hundreds of people's lives, thousands of people's lives, energy, time, I think we can implement a little bit more fairness. And if we find, because the schedule doesn't allow that, we can find more creative solutions than just like butting our head against the wall going, this is how it is. You just have to suffer with the fact that you have the audacity of the computer putting you against those players. So, I don't know if this would solve everything. Obviously, there's some problems that can come with this, but I ultimately think you need more data points that the player has control over before you get into the op percentage, win percentage. And then I think you're going to have a more fair experience, and everyone's going to have a better time. And also, lastly, I think helps better capture performances across tournaments, right? If someone at a tournament, goes like 14-0 and they got 14 points, you'd be like, that is a generational performance, versus someone who, goes 14-0 and, it's 3 games every single time, right? It's just like they got there. They still get the wins, but again, it shows, it captures how dominating and how strong a team is versus everyone, right? And I think that affects our team building. You want probably team building that's a little bit more, Swiss Army knife, which is probably how we should be building our teams anyway. So I don't think it hurts our fundamentals to begin with. So let me know what you think. If you think right now the system's perfect and everyone's being dramatic, or if you think that there are some better ideas or ways to implement points or different differentials, let me know in the comments. But I love competition. I have this sense of fairness, and I just want to make things fair. And is that so wrong? Is that so wrong? I hope not. Hope you have a wonderful day.